Thanks. Good morning. I wanted to start today with a quote from Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou, the great writer, passed away last year, and she left us, of course, with many important lessons, and this is one of them, I think. Now that I know better, I do better. And the problems that we face today are increasingly being described as wicked problems due to how complex they are and how widespread they are. But if we imagine the future, think 25 years from now, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we actually really have no idea what kind of challenges we're going to face. And so for the wicked problems of today and the uncertainty of tomorrow, we're going to need a diverse set of knowledge. But in many ways, we already do know better. We're just letting so much of that knowledge slip away. This is the island of Malekula in the South Pacific nation of Vanuatu. Vanuatu has the highest levels of cultural diversity per capita of anywhere on the planet, for now. Not that long ago, a boat left this bay carrying an old, sick man. I'll call him David. Now, the boat was heading up the island to a health clinic, but the seas were rough, it was dark, and unfortunately, the boat had left a little too late, and David was a little too sick. So, a few hours later, the sound of the engine could be heard coming back across the bay, and soon the wailing spread across the village. David had died. Now, the friends and family of David, of course, mourned his passing. But you didn't know David, right? And 150,000 people die on this planet every single day. So why should we mourn the passing of this one man, David? Well, David was one of 3 remaining speakers of an indigenous language. And now the 2 last speakers are also old, frail men. And when they soon pass, so too will the language. Now, what's remarkable about this story, actually, is that it's not particularly unique. Humans today collectively speak 7,000 different languages. But in the lifetime of my children, 2 days ago, my son celebrated his 10th birthday, to my astonishment. And my daughter is 6. And in their lifetime, as many as half of these languages will disappear. And this leaves us, I think, with 3 fundamental questions that we really need answers to. The first one is, should we be worried about this loss of cultural diversity? The second is, why is it happening? And the third is, what should we do about it? But before we get to those questions, I wanted to note, importantly, that cultural diversity is about a lot more than just language. And to do so, I wanted to give you an example. I had the privilege to live and work for several years in Aotearoa, which is also known as New Zealand. The Maori people of Aotearoa speak te reo. And in te reo, there's a word, whenua. Now, whenua means placenta. Right? This is the nourishment we get in the womb. Right? It's our literal lifeblood. But this same word also means land. So now I ask you for a moment to imagine, even though it's really impossible to do so, but try for a moment to imagine that you grew up Maori. Would you have the same relationship to the land that you do today? And then consider that this is one concept. So if we think about the totality of all the concepts in this culture, of the whole culture, well, then we begin to realize that when we're talking about cultural diversity, we're talking about thousands of different ways of seeing the world and our place in it. Okay, so let's get to our questions. Our first question is, should we be worried about the loss of cultural diversity? Well, first, I think that this answer to this question is about rights. It's about the rights of indigenous people to determine the future of their cultures. Rights that are far too often across the world ignored or even undermined. But let's be be cynical for a moment, because unfortunately, the policies of governments around the world have been quite cynical when it comes to the rights of indigenous people. So let's ask a slightly different question. Let's ask, what is the value that this cultural diversity has for the rest of humanity? To do that, let's look at a disease that has plagued our species for thousands of years. In a certain light, it's almost beautiful. But malaria affects 200 million people a year. Now, the first widespread treatment for malaria was developed by the indigenous people of Peru from the bark of the cinchona tree. And then, ignoring intellectual property rights, the British East India Company took quinine and spread its use around the world. To do so, they had to recognize that quinine, well, people didn't really like it. It's really bitter. So they mixed it with something that was sweeter, that people did like. And voila, the gin and tonic. Now, the tonic contains quinine. If you go to the supermarket today, it's still there. It's on the bottle. And the gin, well, people like the gin. Quinine saved thousands of lives. Malaria did not enjoy this party. Malaria developed resistance, and today the most widespread and increasingly effective treatment for malaria is artemisinin. Artemisinin comes from a Chinese herbal remedy. Today, artemisinin is saving thousands of lives. Now, I ask you for a moment to imagine, where would we be without the indigenous people of Peru, their worldview, and quinine? Or where would we be without the Chinese herbalists and their worldview and artemisinin? Where would we be if we just had the British? We'd have a whole lot of gin and no tonic. Right? Okay, so if we agree that we need to respect and uphold the rights of indigenous people, and that cultural diversity has a value for all of humanity, well, then we get to our next question. Right? Why is it disappearing? And here I think we need to recognize, first, that culture belongs to people, and that culture is not static. Culture is not something that we can just take and put in a museum. Culture is dynamic and constantly changing. The other thing we need to recognize is that contact, the communication, that television, that Facebook, Twitter, the internet, that alone, that contact alone does not drive the loss of cultural diversity. About 15 years ago, I was in Peru. I was working on a tributary of the Amazon. And I was in a small community, and the sun was setting, and there was a soccer game going on in a field. And I was standing on the edge of the field watching the soccer game next to a woman who had her pet parrot on her shoulder. And across the field and above that tropical forest, the moon was rising. And she turned to me and she said, "Does the moon shine in your land?" Whoa. I said, "Yes, the moon does shine in the United States." And then, without skipping a beat, she asked her next question. "Do you know Monica Lewinsky?" Now, what's incredible about this to me was that that woman spoke an indigenous language. She used indigenous science to manage her resources. By so many different measures, her culture was not threatened, even though she'd heard of Ms. Lewinsky. So if it's not contact that's driving the loss of cultural diversity, well, then what is? Here I think we need to recognize that increasingly, a smaller and smaller number of cultural groups are determining the shape and fabric of our societies. A small number of cultural groups, many of which we are a part of, are determining our systems of law, of education, of government, our economies, our natural resource management systems. And it is this imbalance of power that is driving the loss of cultural diversity. I ask you now to think back to David, back on Malekula. Not the moment of his death, but when he's raising his kids. And David has a choice to make. Because ultimately, the future of cultural diversity is about these choices. It's a choice we're making. And when David makes this choice, he makes it based on the same thing that all parents make these choices on. He's trying to create a way that his children can survive and thrive. And so he looks around at the systems of his society, at the schools where he's going to send his kids to be educated, at the markets where his family is going to get the goods they desire, at the laws of the land, and he sees that all these systems are controlled by another cultural group, speaking another language. And so David makes the only choice he's given, really. He leaves his culture behind, his language behind, and he pushes his kids off into this new world. And it's in this way that cultural diversity is lost. So, we get to our last question. What can we do about it? And I think here we need to first recognize how imbalanced the playing field really is across the world. Think about the school where David's going to send his kids. The school is taught in English. The textbooks in that school are written in a far-off place, and the examples are from that far-off place, a place where David's kids have never been, and in all likelihood, never ever will go. This same imbalance when it comes to culture exists in many of our schools, too. I have the privilege sometimes to be able to volunteer in my kids' school. And not that long ago, I was in a kindergarten class. And I think one of the things you realize when you go to kindergarten classes, I'm sure many of you have done, is how amazing kindergarten teachers are. Right? I mean, they're incredibly creative people. They also have to be some of the most patient human beings on the entire planet. Right? And of course, we don't pay them nearly enough money. But the other thing we realize is that the kindergarten teachers have barriers based on the system in which they're working, based on the materials which they're provided. So I'm in this kindergarten classroom, and I'm sitting around a table. It's a pretty diverse school. So there's a kid from Vietnam, there's kids from Libya, a bunch of kids from Colorado. We're talking about prepositions. I'm just preaching to the choir here. You all know prepositions. On, under. Now they're in kindergarten, so they're learning their prepositions with pairs of pictures. Right? And so, for example, there's a table, and there's a cat. The cat is under the table. Right? So they go learning their prepositions. We get to this pair. And a little girl from Colorado jumps out of her chair, because kindergartners are excited to learn, right? And she says, over! The cow jumped over the moon. She's got it. And then over here are the two kids from Libya with huge eyes. What? Right? I mean, you imagine them going home to talk to their parents, right? We thought it was crazy, Mom and Dad, that people put these boards on their feet, they go swooshing down these snowy slopes, but that was nothing, right? Today we learned that in the United States, cows jump over the moon, right? Wild. Because, of course, they're learning a lot more than prepositions here, aren't they? I mean, the lesson is embedded in culture. And that, in and of itself, is a good thing. In fact, all lessons, every single one of them, is embedded in culture. The challenge that we face for cultural diversity is that increasingly our lessons are embedded in one culture. All over the world, cows are jumping over the moon. An English nursery rhyme. Okay, so how do we respond then? What do we do? Well, first, I think we can't be naive. We can't assume that we're going to equally balance power across all 7,000 different cultural groups. But we can take small steps to begin to start to level that playing field. And I'm just going to give you one example of a community that we've worked in and how they've done it. And to do so, we have to go back to the beginning of our story, back to Malakula in Vanuatu. And these communities decided that they would talk to the teachers, they would talk to the administrators of the schools, and they said, look, you guys get 4 days. We're taking 1 day back. And they used indigenous architecture, and they built an alternative structure. And there the kids go 1 day a week. And the elders of the community come, and they teach them in their indigenous language. They teach them the key skills they need to live together as a community. They teach them indigenous science and how they use it to manage resources. They teach them to be proud of who they are and their culture. And these communities argue that in this way, these kids will be better prepared to deal with those wicked problems of today and that uncertainty of tomorrow. And I'd agree. These kids are able now to draw from the worldview and the knowledge systems that have been developed across generations in that place. And they're also able to draw from the worldviews and knowledge systems that are being transmitted through the conventional school system. And so they have a diverse set of knowledge to draw from. Now, I think we have answers to our three big questions. I think we absolutely need to be worried about the loss of cultural diversity. We need to respect and uphold the rights of indigenous people. And we need to seek to create systems in our societies that celebrate cultural diversity, that explore our differences, and then embrace multiple ways of thinking. And if we can do that, well, then I think we'll be better prepared for tomorrow. But if we don't do that, then our grandchildren are going to grow up in a world that is far less diverse, and they won't even know it. So I began with a quote from Maya Angelou, and I'll end with a quote from Maya Angelou. She told us that it's time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there's beauty and there's strength.